maybe when you sort of craft the perfect song, it takes some time to work on it on an instrument, or do you think that process is not an extra value?
It depends. There's two ways of looking at it. The first way of looking at it is the way you're just suggesting. The second way of looking at it is, when is the point in time when you're most emotionally connected to the material and the performance? The moment you've written it. I tell you what, when sometimes I write songs and you come up with a vocal melody, you come up with a lyric, the reason you've come up with that lyric and that vocal melody at that moment in time is because you are the most emotionally connected to the emotional state that created, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to sound pretentious here, but if I come up with a lyric, the reason I've come up with that lyric at that moment in time is because that's the emotional state I'm in at the moment I come up with that lyric. When I perform that vocally, I'm most connected, I'm most in tune with the sentiment of that lyric. If I come to re-record that vocal 3 months later or 6 months later, I may be in a completely different place in my life and emotionally. I'm not going to put the same... The connection between the sentiment of the lyric and the performance is never going to be as strong as it is at the moment of inception, if that makes sense.
Does the technical aspect of also recording it and getting it right,
but I think that's become too prevalent. You know, I mean, I'm someone that's known for making records that sound sonically quite good, but I have to say one thing I struggle with is trying not to overcook, trying to keep it a bit sloppy, trying to keep it a bit more organic. Because I tell you what, a lot of the records, particularly the ones I've worked on, I've remixed stuff from the 70s. I realise how much the sloppiness is part of what makes those records special. And that in a way, although we have the ability, for one of my absolute bête noirs, the thing I hate the most is auto-tune and melodyne. And I hear it on every record now. It's like the vocal has become like a synthesizer.
But has there for you been a period that maybe you tended to maybe perfectionize the sound and the recordings, and is there a certain moment in time where you sort of went back to...
I'm trying to listen. I was brought up in this sort of in terms of the way I learned to make records very much in the 80s, and that was the kind of era for you know, producers like Trevor Horn coming along and revolutionising recording, and everything suddenly had to be perfect. You know, you'd sample one note of the bass player into the Fairlight, and then you'd program it because it was perfectly in time and perfectly in tune. And I think what I realise as time goes on is actually the records I love the most, the sound of the most, are the records where things are not perfect. So I'm almost having to like educate myself out of that kind of temptation, not to tidy up everything, not to tune everything up. It's hard. It's really hard. But I think the records are starting to sound more organic and more alive and a bit more human.
One thing that it's about maybe the previous subject we talked about, that you don't have a family. Was this a conscious decision to, at some point, that you wanted to focus and take music as your career instead of having two maybe separate lives?
No, it wasn't a conscious decision. I've never been interested in having a family.
Just
I don't want kids. I don't want kids, I never have. I still don't.
So you think that in that case that
I think I would have
to that maybe that decline of an artist?
I think I would have been like that anyway. You know, even if I hadn't been a musician, I think I would have been like that anyway. It doesn't appeal to me. And I meet more and more people for whom the same is true. Not just men, but women too. I meet more and more people my age and you know, in their 30s that are making the decision, you know what? It doesn't appeal to me. I don't want to. I don't think it's a prerequisite to, you know, to procreate. Maybe some other people will look at me and think that's very sad. You know,
no,
I don't think it's sad at all. I have no impulse. I don't miss it. I have a dog. I love my dog very much. But I guess as a byproduct of that, I have been able to produce more work. I don't take my kids to school in the morning. I go to the studio in the morning. I don't take my kids to the zoo at the weekend. I go to the studio at the weekend. So yes, obviously by definition, it makes more time for that.
How is it? Yeah, maybe you just can briefly explain where the project title comes from. Who came up with it?
It came from one of the song titles, and it was literally like we didn't really have a title for the project, and we just sort of thought, well, I quite like that song title. I wrote the lyrics for the record. I wrote them in a very...
You wrote them all?
except for half of one song, and just because I think I'm quicker than Mikael, because we didn't, in a way, we didn't want anything to stop the creative flow, and that includes when you're writing music and you're putting down acoustic guitar parts, electric guitar parts, piano parts, string parts. Okay, we need a vocal line. Okay, but we need some lyrics. Okay, I'll quickly write something. And 9 times out of 10, that quickly writing something became definitive, you know. It didn't, because once you've written and recorded something, you almost can't imagine anything else. You know what it's like when you do a demo and you can't. So the lyrics that I wrote very quickly, which were quite abstract, quite surreal, and quite impressionistic, we didn't go back and rewrite them. And one of the images that just came from, I don't know where, was Storm Corrosion. But in a way, I liked it because it suggested 2 things. It suggested, number one, something natural, like a storm, and it also suggested something old and decaying. And I liked that kind of fusion of the natural and the kind of industrial decay, this idea of rust, corrosion, something that feels very old. And I think one thing we were very set on is that we wanted the album to sound like it didn't belong to this time or any time. It kind of almost existed outside of time. So the idea that certain sounds we made deliberately to sound like old and corroded and rusting and lo-fi, which is not a new thing. You know, people have been doing that since the 90s, really, this whole kind of trend for lo-fi. But so that's where the idea of the mixing the organic and the kind of industrial, the idea of corrosion and the storm seemed kind of in a way to encapsulate something about the project.